numerous presentations now about deer and about moose and about black bear, but I haven't gotten to talk about mountain goats yet, and in the 6 years that I've been here, I'm the area biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. My name's Charlotte Westing. We've done some really exciting work with mountain goats, and I'm excited to share it with you. So, I'll give you a little preview of how I'm going to structure my talk tonight. I'll first talk about some life history of mountain goats, because they're just a really fascinating species. And then I'll get into the management, so how we do our surveys, how we administer our hunts, and then talk about what our harvest data is telling us. And finally, I'd like to talk about some threats that goats are facing. Although I don't have a ton of time to go into the level of depth that I'd love to, and I know there's a lot of mountain goat enthusiasts here. So really I'm just excited to share the tip of the iceberg with you to start a dialogue, and I hope that you'll share your thoughts and that we can think about these things in a bit more depth. So first I've got to give you some background about the local history of this animal. It's a traditionally used species. It was used for meat, horn was used for tools, and then of course the hide was used for clothing, sometimes being woven into wool and sometimes just being used as a straight fur. It's the only native ungulate in Unit 6. Deer were of course introduced in the early teens and 20s. Moose were largely from an introduction in the late 40s, early 50s. So they're our native ungulate, and they were documented early by some of the first white explorers here, like Captain Cook in 1785, and others since then. Captain Cook thought he was buying hides from natives who were selling polar bears to him, and later learned that it was mountain goats. And he's not the only guy that got confused, as you can tell by Sheep Bay, which we have a couple of bays up from here, and no sheep live there. They're endemic to the mainland, to Bainbridge, to Culross, and to Knight Island, but they don't exist on Culross or Knight Island anymore. They were greatly reduced by the 1940s, and this is probably a result of humans that were looking at salteries, mining, or the military population that had begun to crop up in Whittier that was working there on the tunnel and whatnot. They also traditionally existed in the Heaney Range and were probably overhunted there. In 1976, mountain goat observation area was started. For a long time, Robbie Maxwell had a sign outside of his house that used to be posted up there. But it was probably too little too late. Those goats have been gone from there for a long time. Every once in a while, someone sees a billy. I think the last time that happened was in the mid to late 2000s. And I look for him every time I fly a survey, but he'd be getting pretty old at this point, and I haven't seen any new animals over there. I suspect that all the development that's happened at 6 Mile is a pretty big deterrent with dogs and houses and rivers and highways for them to cross. It could, in theory, happen, but it would take more than a few animals to really start up a population there again, but it's something I dream about. So really, our significant populations of goats exist east of Unakwick and then in the southwestern portion of Prince William Sound. There are some goats scattered in between Unakwick and Bainbridge, but they're not found there in really huntable numbers. And I'll show you some maps so you'll get a feel for where our hunt areas and our goat distributions are in a bit. So mountain goats, scientific name, Oreamnos americanus, and they're in the order Bovidae. So that means they're lumped in with your cows and your goats and your sheep, but they're special because they have their own tribe. They're in Rupercapridae, and they're the only member of Rupercapridae in North America. Their closest relatives are Goral, Sarouse, I don't even know if I'm saying these right, and Chamois, all found in Asia and Europe. So they're a pretty special animal that we have in North America. There's really nothing else like them. So their average weights, your males can be up to 350 pounds, but the average weight's more like 260 pounds. Females can be more like 230 pounds for a max weight, but average is about 180. And then for lifespan, it's pretty rare for them to get older than 12, but a female can get up to 18. But most animals are going to be under 12. And I have two pretty special billies here tonight. This one is 13 and was a natural mortality that somebody found. And then this one is 11, and this one was found in an avalanche chute after snowpocalypse. So they're both pretty awesome examples of animals that live for a long time. So I can't really talk about the management of goats without talking about their reproduction, because reproduction is really what leads us to manage the way that we do. So goats don't reproduce. Nanny goats don't go through their don't become sexually mature until they're 4 years old. In perfect range conditions, they could do that sooner, at maybe 2 or 3 years old. But most studies have found 4 or even 5 years old is when they first become sexually mature. And of course, the later an animal or species comes to sexual maturity and the fewer young it has, the more vulnerable it is to overharvest. Their estrus only happens one time in a season. Some animals, like moose for example, if they don't get pregnant the first estrus, they can go through a second or even a third estrus. Goats only have one, and that's their one chance. And it only lasts for a few days that they're receptive to breeding. So what this results in is males and some pretty creepy behavior for a long time, following females around starting in late October, even though the breeding actually occurs in mid to late November. So these guys are basically lurking around groups of females, staying far enough away that they don't piss the ladies off. But if any other males come, they try to sort out their differences about who's going to be the lucky guy when that special moment happens on the mountain. The successful males are going to be between 5 and 10 years old. The kids that result from these breedings are going to be born in mid to late May, and it's almost always one. Twins are very rare, but they are definitely possible when conditions are great. So, with that in mind, let's talk about some physical characteristics of mountain goats that make them so special. And I brought some exciting visual aids that when we're done talking tonight, you guys are welcome to come and feel and take a look. It's all pretty cool. Mountain goats are just fascinating. For starters, they've got this luxurious fur. It's got guard hairs that are about 8 inches long and hollow. And then underneath that, this dense woolly layer that's 2 or 3 inches thick. And then they have really thick skin, and I'll talk a little bit about that more in a little bit. They form these awesome pantaloons, which any animal that wears pantaloons has just got to be cool. And then they've got, of course, the beautiful facial hair, the goatee, makes the ladies crazy. They shed their winter coat in June and mostly are done with that process by early July or mid-July. And at that point, they've got a coat that's a whole lot more like a Labrador Retriever would have. Then pregnant nannies are the last ones to do that. They're the last ones to shed their coats. And then their coats are full again by the time you get into mid-October. So that's the fur. Then the muscles and bones. They've got this massive chest. They've got large shoulder hump, and they're just beefy looking animals. And this is probably one of the #1 ways that guys get tripped up on shooting nannies, is they get swept up in how muscular and massive the animal appears, and they're like, well, it's got to be a male. And that's just how they all are. And they're built that way so they can form these feats of agility up in the mountains. Some of the things they're capable of, so they have these short cannon bones in their legs, and what that gives them is a really low center of gravity. And that's great, because it would be terrible for running fast, but that's not their strategy. They don't get away from predators by moving fast. They get away from predators by deliberately moving and getting to places that nothing else can or would want to get to. So in the process of doing that, I've read reports of them basically doing handstands. You know, you walk to a point on a cliff, you can't go any farther, and you can't backwards moonwalk out. So the goat will just do a handstand, put its butt in the air, and twist around, and then go out the way it came in. Other stories about goats essentially doing a one-hooved pull-up up onto a cliff are there. If you guys want to come in, there's some room in the front seat, and I can embarrass you and make you walk in. Come on in, come on in. So those are all interesting things about their muscle and bone structure. And their hooves, of course, they have 4 hooves, but they've got 2 toes on each hoof. And those hooves are able to work independently of each other to a much larger degree than other hooved animals can. Some people have talked about their hooves as being like suction cups. They've got this hard outer shell and this soft inner pad. And I don't really think that's a really great comparison, because they're not, you know, suction cupping to the rocks. But they are capable of gripping to a degree that is just different than most other ungulates can do. They also have dew claws or dew pads on their behind their hooves, and I think those serve mountain goats much more than they serve a lot of other animals. They actually use them when they're grazing, you know, to control their descents a lot more than something like a moose would need to do. So another cool adaptation. So now I'll talk a little bit about their horns. So horns are composed, of course, of hair, really, really compact hair. And it's an outer sheath of keratin that's covering an inner core of bone. And so for every year of their life, when they're experiencing seasonal variations of food availability, they're putting on a ring of, we call it an annuli, on their horn, and you can read that. It's similar to how you would read rings on a tree. So each of these horns tells the story of how old these animals were. So the other thing is that the horn structure is different between males and females, but it's not obvious like it is for sheep, for example, where telling an adult male from an adult female is very, very easy to do. And that's why it's legal to shoot a nanny or a billy, is because if we made nannies illegal take, it would make criminals out of people. It's too hard to do. It's not impossible. It just takes a lot of time and effort, and even the best hunters get tripped up sometimes. So a great way to tell the difference is I'll just explain some of the differences to you. This billy has really broad bases, so he makes a great example. You can use the base and measure it in comparison to the eye. So a billy should have a base that's wider than the width of its eye, whereas a nanny, like this one, has a much skinnier base. There's also a difference in the curvature. So a billy's horn curves very gradually, whereas a nanny's horn is straight for much of the distance of the horn and then curves kind of at the last minute. And then another difference is the space between their horns. And these goats are the same age. These goats are both, can't remember if they're 7 or 8. The distance between the horns is smaller on a male than for a female. But it's interesting that, you know, this male and this male have very different curvature, right? This male is more of a straight until the last minute curvature than this guy, and he's more similar to the nanny. Now, part of this is that there is a gland on the back of the horn that secretes a lot of oil, and it's a much bigger on a billy than a nanny, but they both have it. And this one has eroded away the horn on the back, and when you guys come up and handle, you'll be able to see that better. So that makes this base look skinnier than it actually would be if that weren't the case. I guess I could pass this around if you want. And this other one, this 13-year-old that someone found near Valdez, he's down to bone core in the back. You can look at it.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yep. It irritates, or it goes through the hair. I don't know. Maybe it's too cumbersome to pass. I don't know. We'll try it. Okay, so that's some interesting stuff about the horns. We have a lot of materials on our website to help you learn about telling the difference between males and females. And if you're interested in goat hunting, there are goat hunter education materials and then a subsequent quiz that you can take with pictures, and you click on the pictures and you can get in closer and make your judgment about if it's a nanny or a billy. So there's a lot of good materials, and I brought some booklets that also explain nanny and billy identification if you're interested in going goat hunting or just getting better at it. So in addition to those physical characteristics, there's also behavioral adaptations that are important to understand, and those can also help make the determination between a nanny and a billy. One of them is the sexual segregation that goes on. So if you see groups of animals, particularly groups of animals that are down low, any group larger than 10 is probably mixed sex and age animals that are mostly nannies and younger animals. Billies can sometimes, a lot of times they're just by themselves up on the high mountains just doing their own antisocial thing, but sometimes they can be in bachelor groups. And generally they're kind of spaced out though. They like a little bit of personal space, more than you'll see in your groups of nannies and kids. And really the only time all of these are mixing together is in that creeping breeding time. I don't know if any other professionals use that to describe that behavior, but I'm going to. So another thing that billies do is they create wallowing pits. And it's not really well understood, all the reasons why they do it. Obviously, it makes them really smelly, and they like that, and they think the ladies like it. But they wallow in pits, and they pee in pits, and they wallow some more. And then they get dark rumps that are just gross and dark. And it's another way, although it's not a definitive characteristics, because apparently some ladies like to do that too, they end up with a big dark patch on their rump, and you can sometimes use that to help with your determination. So I mentioned before the harem defense. That's another thing that they do. The females will only breed with one male, but the male will breed many females. Another interesting thing about mountain goats is their use of posturing. So mountain goats are different than other animals. They're not like sheep. They won't go head to head over and over again. They won't do it like moose do either. They actually kind of avoid actual physical contact at all costs. It's pretty rare that they actually come to blows. And that's because those daggers on their head are actually capable of a lot of harm. Puncture wounds are a big deal, and when you're a species that already experiences a high amount of mortality, it wouldn't be a very good evolutionary mechanism for them to have to be creating mortal wounds. So most of what they do is just trying to look like the biggest, toughest guy on the block and hoping that the other guys buy it. And so they spend a lot of time putting on a really good show and getting all puffed up and doing elaborate dances. When they do end up thinking about fighting, their fighting stance is not a head-to-head fighting stance, it's a head-to-rump fighting stance, and they're just basically doing circles. And if they do come to blows, it's almost always a head-to-rump contact. And as a result, they have dermis on their rump that is significantly thicker than the rest of their body. And sheep are similar in that sheep have thicker skin around their neck than the rest of their body. When you think about it, when you're going head to head and you have a horn with hooks on it, that's the place where you're most likely to suffer an injury. So why not have the thickest skin there? These guys have the thickest skin on the part of them that's closest when they're running away. So if you're ever going to make gloves out of your goat, I guess go for the rump. Then their other interesting adaptation is just that the nannies are never very far from their kids. I've found it written that they're never more than a meter away from their kids, but I've observed plenty of nannies that are farther than that, and I think it's more like 20 feet is more reasonable, but they stay very close together, and often the nanny is downhill of the kid. Most of the time they're downhill of the kid, and just keeping them from falling off a cliff while they're getting coordinated. They're obviously very precocious and capable of getting up and moving around very, very, very quickly and climbing very, very quickly, but they need mom to keep them from making a big tumble. So for their habitat usage in the summer, well, they're the perfect generalist. Goats and sheep in general don't have super precise diet constraints because you couldn't. When their big survival mechanism is living in a place where nothing else wants to be. So they can graze on grasses, herbs, low-growing shrubs, and they can browse on blueberry bushes, hemlock, lichen. I've seen them use a really broad range of habitats. So obviously I see them in this kind of stuff that Milo and I saw where they're feeding on these patches. But definitely I've seen them up close to the 5,000 foot mark where you can't even think of what they would be eating up there. I've seen them on lots and lots of snow patches, obviously not feeding while they're there, probably just ruminating and staying cool. I've seen them down on riverbeds, I've seen them on glacier moraines, I've even seen them on the coast, licking salt. So, and then of course I see them on the fringe, on the edge of forest where I won't be able to see them in just a few moments when they dip down into the timber. So they're utilizing a broad range of habitats, and basically anything under 5,000 feet and almost anything growing is fair game. During that peak growing season, they can gain 10 to 15 pounds a month. So it's a very important time for them. And I'll talk a little bit more about climate change and summer in a little bit. Winter habitats, on the other hand, they're operating on a negative energy balance. So they're probably not going to put on any fat, and they're just burning through what they've saved. And so they use the timber often to avoid deep and wet snowpack, but they're surprisingly good at wading through it despite their short leg bones. But all of this is a factor of why mortality is so high, especially in kids, things, and yearlings. And that's just because, you know, kids and yearlings are trying to put on body size, in addition to putting on fat for the winter. Adults are just putting on fat for the winter. And as a result, the chances of them getting what they need to deal with that negative energy balance are a lot slimmer in a young animal. So 40 to 60% mortality in kids, 20 to 30% mortality in kids, and most of that cause is starvation, just not going into the winter with what you need to make it through the whole time. But there's also predation. People report finding wolf or goat hair in wolf or coyote scats, and then they can fall victim to accidents like this little guy. Who knows? Maybe he died of natural causes and then his carcass got swept away in the avalanche. But some goats surely die in avalanches and or just tumbling off cliffs, although it's rarely been observed that they just tumble off cliffs. They're pretty good at getting around up there. So those are the basics on mountain goat life history, and so now I'll tell you a little bit about our goat management program. So our population assessments we do by conducting aerial minimum count surveys every year, and we do that in the window of peak snowmelt in between July and October. So that's basically involves me or my proxy, whoever I get to help me, but usually me, flying in either Super Cub or 170 and finding as many goats as you can in a designated survey area by covering that area really thoroughly. And then of what you see, determining what are kids and what are adult goats. I take GPS locations on every goat I observe, and that helps me to know that I've covered the area well, and then also to keep from avoiding double counting. And I have to rotate through survey areas because I have 17 different survey areas, which I'll show you in a moment here, and only the capability to probably do like 5 or 6 of them in a year. So I have to rotate through, and I make my decisions on how to rotate through using factors such as understanding how much harvest pressure an area is experiencing, how much time has gone on since the last time it was surveyed, and then whether or not I suspect there's been a change in the trajectory of that population. So maybe I think winter conditions in a certain area have been hard, or maybe the last time I surveyed it, the kid count was low, or maybe the kid count was high, but the number wasn't up yet, and I want to see if it's up and I can provide more hunting opportunity. So anything like that can dictate whether or not I move something up on the survey schedule. And the U.S. Forest Service contributes financially to doing the surveys that we do in 6D. So I'll show you a map. So these are the 17 goat survey areas and goat hunt areas in Unit 6. So you can see Unakwic is right here, and so all of the goats are basically of huntable populations are east of Unakwic, except for this one down by Bainbridge here. So the colored shading behind of kind of the bluish and greens, it shows the different subunits which have different season dates, and that's why I have this here. The numbers are the number of animals that could be taken at the start of the season, what the maximum allowable harvest was. And the crosshatch shows the areas that I was intending to survey and that I actually ended up surveying before the season started. So I'm basically putting the hunters on notice that the quotas in these areas with the crosshatch could change, whereas the ones that are in purple are probably not going to change. So this just gives you an idea of what our quotas are and where and how I spread out my survey effort. And so this is an example of what one of my survey track logs looks like. I don't know, Troy, did you ever do any goat survey work? You did, so you remember. Everywhere you see a number is a waypoint of either an animal or a group of animals. Chances are if you see a whole bunch of tight circles in close proximity to one of these numbers, it's because we were trying to get a count on a group. So it's one of these things where you kind of got a lot going on for a while, looking back and forth from a data sheet and out a window and grinding out circles, and it's not for the weak stomach. This is just a map that gives a general idea of our goat densities throughout Unit 6, with the darkest colors representing the highest goat densities. and the lightest colors representing the lowest. And the only one I haven't been able to survey in the last 6 years is this one right here. So these are all pretty relatively up to date. But you can see, like, this is the area by Icy Bay. It has a high goat density, so does the Ragged Mountains, and so does the area around Titlic. Our areas right here close to town are pretty good. Same with the one by Columbia. So some areas with lower goat densities are like around Valdez here and by Berg Lake. So that's where the densities are. I picked 4 hunt areas closest to home because I thought they were the ones that people were most interested in hearing about. With 17 goat units, I can't go through them one by one and tell you about what I've heard, but I picked 4. And so I'm going to start from east to west and just explain them, what I've learned about how they're doing. So I'll start with Saddlebag, McKinley Lake area. So when I showed up here in 2013, it hadn't been surveyed since '04, but I've been able to do it in 13, 16, and 18, and it's looking pretty stable at about average abundance. It does have variable kid numbers from year to year. The past few years, we haven't had much for harvest out of this unit, and I think that's mostly driven by distribution of goats, because it can be a hard area. You have to do a lot of walking before you actually get to them in this unit, but in some years, the goats will be distributed where they're a lot more accessible. So that's McKinley. This one is for the Sheridan Mountain area, so it's in between the Scott Glacier and the Sheridan Glacier. And it was surveyed a little bit more when I showed up. It had been done fairly recently. But I've been able to look at it in 13, 16, and 18. In 16, I got this high count. And 3 out of 5 years, the kid counts have been really good there. But we had closure for a few years in this area entirely because of high nanny take. So it's something that I watch pretty carefully because it's one of the most accessible hunts. People go right up Sheridan Trail. There's often there's a box canyon right there that's often full of some animals, and people often shoot animals there, and they're often nannies. So, but Sheridan doesn't seem to be suffering for that at the moment. Its numbers seem to show it's at a pretty normal area for it. The area between Scott Glacier and the Rude River, where EF Mountain and the Queens Share are, when I showed up, this number was really low in 2010, and I got really worried. There was a 2 goat quota, and I thought, man, if this population is doing that, I don't think we should have a hunt there at all. But I was able to survey it in 2014 and got a record count, and then was able to survey it again in 2017 and got an even bigger count. So things are looking pretty good in 232, and one of the things that I think supports that is the size at age. We found we have pretty small sample sizes for all the areas that we do horn checks on, but we had 3 4-year-olds that were over 9 inches in length, which is pretty dang respectable when you're 4 years old, and 1 that was over 10. So they're showing very rapid growth in this area, and everything just kind of adds up that this count in 2010 was just very artificially low.
Do they migrate?
There could be some movement, and I'll tell you the story. This is 242, and it's the next one over, so it's from the Rude River to Corvina. And I was able to survey this one in 2013 and 2018, and it's been stable across the last 3 counts, but it's variable in subunits. And the subunit that's closest to 232, the one I just talked about, was really low this time. And I thought, what if those goats moved into 232? And this is the big, change that we've seen. But in the end, so then I thought, well, maybe that happened, and I thought, well, maybe I just got a terrible count. It wasn't an ideal day when I flew that subunit. But I waited, and I got a perfect day, and I went back and I did it again, and I was within 5 goats of my previous count. So I thought, well, I'm probably somewhere in the ballpark, right? So they could potentially move, but the way that we've drawn these survey maps is kind of considering how we think they're moving for the most part. So they're drawn from drainage to drainage instead of from mountaintop to mountaintop, considering the fact that a goat is probably going to stay on the mountain but not necessarily cross the river. But it's certainly possible, especially when you get in headwaters of some of those things, that they could move, and I'll just never know. But in the end, it all ended up, you know, this is pretty stable population, really, especially when you're looking at minimum counts. That's a really stable number to get, especially since my brain is not very good at remembering numbers. So I go out on these surveys and I have no memory, even the ballpark of numbers that I would expect to find. I'm like a clean slate every time I go. I'm like, what do we find? Maybe it'll be 50, maybe 500, I don't know. So when I come back to the office and plug in the numbers and we're right in the ballpark, it's like, well, you know, I'm probably not completely off. Who knows? This unit has our highest quota. It has 21 goats available, and then there's also a federal hunt that allows additional opportunity. There are a couple parts of the sound that have federal hunts, and those allow for an earlier season, and they also allow for some additional participation because, as I'll explain a little bit more in a bit, we have a nanny provision where if you shoot a nanny, you can't hunt in Unit 6 again for 5 years, but you can participate in a federal hunt, even though you shot a nanny. So it provides opportunity in 2 ways. So I put together a slide that then summarizes all of these areas that I couldn't talk about in exceptional depth, and I color-coded it for you. But this one area that I haven't been able to survey yet is the Caliac and Grindle Hills, and I hope to do that this summer. But these in green are the ones that are showing high. So over by the Columbia Glacier to Yanaquik, the Valdez area, the South Valdez Arm, the area around Titlik, the area around Corvina, the Mount Eac Queenshire unit, Goat Mountain, East Ductaw, and then Icy Bay Brower Ridge. That one's pretty exciting because it's high again after being really low following some logging. And then there's some stable areas, so the Route to Corvina, McKinley, Sheridan, the Ragged Mountains, Bainbridge to Fairfield, and the Shoup Glacier to Columbia Glacier. And then there are 3 areas that are low, and one of them is Berg Lake. I did not know why. And the other 2 are Don Miller Hills and the Suckling Hills, and those are down from their high counts, which were a very, very long time ago, and they were, so we didn't used to have wolves in this area, but then we got moose. And when we got moose, we got wolves. And the Don Miller Hills are very low-lying areas. They don't have the normal escape terrain that mountain goats need. And so now that we have wolves on the landscape, I don't think we're ever going to have goats in any measurable degree in the Don Miller Hills or Suckling Hills. So that's the general status of goats. Overall, our areas seem to be doing pretty well. Minimum counts are not a very refined tool. They've got lots of problems, but they're the best evidence we have, and they say things are looking pretty good. And I think a lot of that is from mild winters that have allowed for more availability of forage. But there is a lot of concern that there's a cost to changing weather, that all the good that comes from mild winters could be completely negated by the bad that comes from really hot summers. And I can talk about that in a little bit. So now I'll tell you a bit about the details of goat hunting. So for each of these areas, after we fly a survey and get a minimum count, we're just going off our most recent minimum count, we calculate a conservative harvest of 3 to 5%. And I determine which one of these numbers I use based on things like how prone is this area to the harvest of nannies? How rapidly does this usually go? What is the likelihood that I will go over quota? So if it's an area where I've got some of these troubles, I'll go closer to 3%. If it's an area where we never hit the quota, the season always goes the full length, and things are looking great, I'll go 5%. We also use a goat point system. So for a billy, we count 1 animal against that maximum allowable harvest, but if you shoot a nanny, it counts as 2. And if you shoot a goat and then it's unrecoverable, it counts as 1.5. Even if the hunter swears up, down, and sideways that the animal they shot was a billy, most of the time when someone shoots an animal that ends up being a nanny, they did not think that was what it was when they pulled the trigger. And so we usually call those animals unknowns, unless they got up to the animal and then lost it at some point during the retrieve. But unless they get up and make positive identification of sex, we call them unknowns. We have these additional measures to protect nannies. So one of them is the regulation that says if you shoot a nanny in Unit 6, you can't hunt in Unit 6 for 5 years. and that was basically to protect against habitual nanny takers. We also have a mandatory goat hunter orientation. So if you're interested in hunting goats on the road system, it's only on the road system hunts. So 6C and then the one hunt that's right by Valdez. You have to take the goat hunter orientation. It gives you a bunch of information about goats. It gives you some pictures to look at, tests to take, bada bing, bada boom. Once you pass that, you get your permit. And it's a one-time deal. We also use a registration permit system, and we sometimes use special conditions with that. So our road system hunts in Unit 6C, you have to come to Cordova and pick up a permit here. You also have to bring in your horns and have them checked. So those are some of the measures that we take in Valdez. I only issue 12 permits for a 5 maximum allowable goat harvest hunt, and people camp out in the parking lot. I show up 2 weeks before the season. I show up in the morning, I issue my 12 permits, and they pack up camp and go home, and 2 weeks later come back and hunt. So we use a variety of different tools to keep ourselves within the quota. So now I'm going to show you some harvest data. First I put together a graph that just shows the total harvest for each hunt area. And these hunts, I should have flipped this, but this is the easternmost hunt, and this is the westernmost hunt. So you can see the two areas. These are the two areas that are in the northern sound. This one is from the Shoup Glacier to Columbia, and this one is Columbia to Yenakwick. So they take a lot of the harvest. That's where a lot of the harvest comes from, are those two areas. 242 I mentioned has the highest maximum allowable harvest, but as you can see, we don't usually touch that. It's around 20, and most years we don't come close. This year we came closer. So that's just an idea. I put the billies in blue and the nannies are in orange, and then the unrecoverables or unknowns are in green. So you can see how that works out, but I thought it would be a little clearer to show this in percentages and the percentage of nanny take. And when I do it that way, you can really see the two hunts that have the highest nanny take are this one, which is the Valdez Road System hunt, and this one, Sheridan. So the two most accessible areas have, in fact, the highest nanny take. So if you want to look at it as far as who's participating in the hunts, this is, again, same deal. These are the farthest eastern units, and this is the furthest western unit. The non-residents, which are shown in the yellow here, you can see are using those hunt areas in the northern sound, from the Shoup to Yenakwick. Those are most used by guides, and so that's where you see our non-resident use. There's some non-resident use just here north of town, and some non-resident use over in the eastern portions of Unit 6. As far as people who live in Unit 6, you can tell we hunt close to home. So the green bars show us hunting here, and then these are where the Valdez people hunt. And then the non-local Alaskans are a little bit more evenly distributed. Some are coming down here to hunt closer to home, and some are hunting in that northern sound area. So thought I'd put together one showing you season length, red being the shortest season, green being the season that's most likely to last its full length. So you can see the maximum number of days. So the seasons open at different times, and this is why I put this together this way. So everything east of the Copper River is starting August 20th. And so almost all of those seasons have gone their full length. In 1 year, we closed this one, and that brought the average down. But they almost always go their full length. The season in 6C is these 3 units. It opens October 7th, and you can see it usually lasts a month or 2 months. And then in Prince William Sound, all of these units open September 15th, with the exception of Valdez. And you can see some of them last their full length or close to it, and then some last less than a month. The Valdez hunt starts October 1st, and it's only recently, since I went to that restricted permit system, started lasting a little bit longer. It used to be a 1-day hunt, and now it's more like a 6-day.
While you have that map up, can I just make a comment about the federal subsistence hunts? Sure. In the units in Prince William Sound, and not a lot of people use this or take part in it, is why I thought I'd mention it. the units in Prince William Sound, where she has 138 all the way to the southwest corner by Chenega Bay, where the 73 is. All those units, except for the one that has the 2 in it, have a federal subsistence quota, where a very small number actually are set aside for rural residents, and you'd have to live in Cordova, Tititlic, or Chenega, or Whittier to participate. And the purpose of it is you have an opportunity to get out earlier. They start August 20th, or stay out later if the unit gets closed by the state quota, and that sometimes happens in those units near Columbia Glacier. So there is opportunity, and a few people in this room have recently participated in that hunt. But just realize that those permits are available. If you live in Cordova, just come to the Forest Service office and get your permit.
So, some people wanted to know about percentage successful goat hunters. And this graphic shows that. And again, it's more of an expression of your guided users or your transported users. So this area that has 93% success rate, those people are almost entirely guided. Same with this 89% success rate, almost entirely guided. These areas here are used heavily by guides. So are these other blue units. And then these green units are almost nobody is using guides or commercial services. So you can see that it's probably more of an expression of what you're using to support your hunt than anything else, than opportunity. And then I'm sure some people would want to hear about horn length, and I don't really have a lot of great information on this because our sample sizes are low for any given year. If I was going to really look at this, I'd have to back calculate for every goat that's year of birth. And the best way is to, when you're looking at horns, start measuring the distance between annuli. And we've started doing that in our office, but it's only been the last year that we've been doing that. So I'm hoping this information gets a lot better because our quota is like higher. So we'll have bigger sample sizes and we're getting data that will be more helpful. But these are the billies that we've sealed in our office. And this tells you the size that they were, their horn length for each age. This blip here is probably a product of sample size. If you look at the self-measured, self-aged information from hunters throughout Unit 6, it tells a similar story that's a little more smooth without that blip there. And then another way I looked at it was just looking at the number of self-reported 10-inch billies and how that's changed over time. And you can see it wobbles around everywhere. There's not really much you can say with that. So now I'll move on to talking about some threats to goats. A great picture from Milo here. Climate change. A paper from Kevin White and Dave Gregovich showed that with a bunch of different modeling scenarios that they came up with, there is this positive effect that when you have mild winters, you have less amount of time that things for goats to eat is just covered up with snow, and they just have access to more food and perhaps better forage. But the downside is these hotter summers, and what they found was that the cost of the hotter summers exceeded any gains that were had from these milder winters.
How much hotter are the summers?
I don't know, but I get you that paper.
We're getting a lot of rain in the summer here, so that may be negating things in this area, you know?
Well, and that study is not from this area,
Oh.
it's from Southeast. But I have a paper at my office, I'm happy to share it. I actually didn't get to read it in as much depth as I'd like to. I also wonder about avalanche prone, because of course global warming isn't necessarily going to mean always being warmer, right? That's a better way to call it is global weirding, and that's kind of what snowpocalypse was all about. That was a winter that was just on average colder than other years, and the amount of precipitation wasn't that remarkable, although I think it was slightly more. What was remarkable was just that overall temperature was colder, and instead of getting that as a mixture of snow and rain, and off and on snow and rain, it just was all snow. So I wonder about
In the snowpocalypse year, we had snow on the ground until July, even at pretty low elevation. So there was, I bet the food availability may have been pretty bad that year. I don't know.
yeah. And that can have multiple year effects. I wondered about that when I showed up here in 2013, if I was still potentially seeing some effects of just delayed effects from snowpocalypse. But I wonder if it makes for, if rain and snow and really wet snowpack can make for more avalanche prone conditions, and if that can make it more likely that goats will die in those avalanches. And also if rain on snow just creating ice that they can't press through. I mean, I think goats would have less of a hard time with that than say sheep, because they also browse. But it's also possible that they could be affected. Really, we just don't know. And then another question that's also somewhat related to climate change are disease threats, because a lot of diseases that we've never had to deal with before, we're starting to experience in Alaska. Contagious eczema is one that has been around for a long time. It's a virus that causes sores and scabs and blisters on their faces and hooves and sometimes their udders. And it's also known as sore mouth around sheep farmers because it will prevent them from eating and they will die. And it can be disastrous in a population, and that's always been around to some degree, but at pretty low levels. But a lot of diseases that we used to see at very low levels or not at all in Alaska are becoming more prevalent with the changes in weather. And then Mycoplasma pneumoniae is something people were hearing a lot about in the last year, and that's because it's a bacterium that causes respiratory problems, and goats and sheep are really vulnerable to respiratory infections. And it was not found in Alaska until some people did some random disease surveillance and picked it up in a variety of different species. And almost all of the animals they detected it in were completely healthy. And so we're trying to figure out how prevalent MOBI is in our populations and whether or not it does truly cause mortality and morbidity at the same rates that it has in the lower 48, because in the lower 48 it's decimated bighorn sheep and mountain goat populations. And so there's two schools of thought. Among wildlife biologists, there are some that believe we should start really testing animals aggressively and start a culling program. Anytime you find one that's positive, get it out of the herd, nip it in the bud. And then there are people that say, maybe this has been around all the time and we didn't know because we weren't looking for it. And we don't know if it's not causing mortality or morbidity, why does it matter? Maybe our goats are somewhat more resistant to it for some reason, and we should just get more information. So I think on the whole, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game feels like getting more information is where we need to be. So we started a voluntary sampling program, and many people who harvested goats this year brought their goat heads in. When I practiced this, I kept saying their heads in, like Sam and I would nasal swab the hunter. So they brought their goat heads in, and we swabbed the nasal mucosa, and then put that in a growth medium, ship it off to Fairbanks, and they double test. And so that's what they're in the process of right now, is splitting samples and sending them to labs. And both labs don't know what the other one's coming up with. The problem is, the labs are coming up with different things. And so that's all getting sorted out as far as who's coming up with false positives and who's coming up with false negatives. So we hope to have more information about this. I got some pamphlets here, and if you do harvest a goat in the future, we really appreciate voluntary samples. We appreciate voluntary genetic samples. And then, of course, if you harvest a goat in 6C, you've got to bring it in anyways and have us measure it, so you might as well subject it to all the sampling. It's dead anyways. And then another thing the land use managers are thinking about a lot are cumulative effects. So how things like winter recreation, this could include heli skiing, development pressures, and then if hunting pressure is changing and how all of that comes together. And I looked back at our hunting data, or just total number of hunters participating, and it's actually really constant over time. And I wonder if hunting pressure is going to increase, because culturally, hunting seems to be on the decline. And so I'm not exactly sure if we will have more hunting pressure in this area, especially if we remain less connected from the rest of the state and the world. But it's something to definitely keep an eye on because of all the things I listed as far as goats being vulnerable to overharvest. So I included some additional resources because, as I said, I really only scratched the surface tonight. There's a lot of good materials on the Fish and Game website, including lots of stuff about goat identification, updates on diseases such as Moby, and then you can learn all about hunt opportunities here and all over the state. A lot of the really interesting information on the life history of goats I got from A Beast the Color of Winter, written by Douglas Chadwick, and it's a great read. I highly recommend it. It's entertaining and really informative. The Rocky Mountain Goat Alliance has a lot of good materials, including a really great goat identification video with a highly unannoying narrator. And that's also on our Fish and Game website. And then there's some technical papers coming out, like the one about climate change and its potential impact on goats that Kevin White and David Gregovich wrote. They're biologists with Fish and Game down in Southeast. And then this guy, I had to learn how to make special characters today. These guys are from Quebec. They're legendary goat biologists, and they've written a lot of really great and informative papers. So if you're interested in learning more about the science about goats, I would encourage you to look at some of these things. I couldn't fit it all in tonight, and I knew a lot of people just wanted to know some details about local goats, so I had to figure out how to allocate my time. But these are great resources, and you should consider looking into them. So I'd like to invite your questions, and then people can come up and handle away. Yeah.
That district down there by Bainbridge,
Mm-hmm.
is that just kind of the border of 6C, or is, I mean, it seems such a population if they don't migrate.
Yeah.
How is this remote, is that just a
That, oops.
district area?
Oh, now I've done it, cool. It is the boundary of the game unit, and it's over by Seward. So a lot of the participation there is people that are actually accessing it through Seward.
But there's other areas, or is that just a,
It's connected to the Kenai and the Kenai populations.
okay, so it isn't just a
If I
remote.
can get a map, I
Yeah.
can't get this to.
What is that? Is that a whale?
It's a whale going through some fish.
I got it. Never mind.
Cool.
Is that Jeremy's picture of how that goes through Harry?
Mhm.
I think it was,
Rich Brenners.
Or Rich Brenner, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so this number 10 down here is what Barbara's talking about. This is Cape Fairfield right here. And then just a little ways over is Resurrection Day.
But there's other goats in that area, just their district,
Yep,
region.
yep. Unit, I'm not sure, I think it's Unit 7.
Yeah, how far west do they go? I was curious about their range.
Yeah, I mean, they're all over the Kenai in Unit 7 and Unit 15. They have goats all over that. And then goats north.
But not on the
Lake
west side of
George.
Cook Inlet.
They're just, I don't know much about the west side of Cook Inlet. I think that's more sheep country. Stormy saying no, it's Stormy.
No,
Yeah,
Are
he grew up
the,
in the valley.
Are the Kodiak goats introduced?
Yes. Yes, and they're dealing with a different situation down there because they have 2 goat bag limits there. We didn't have any bag limits at all on mountain goats until about the 60s, and then we had 2 goat bag limits, and they were harvesting lots of females during that time, and that's when we realized we were overdoing it. Difference there is that, you know, these were native goats, those are not native goats, and they're really concerned about the potential impact those goats could be having on the range there and the deleterious effects on other species. So actually, in some areas, really trying to bring the population down. Yeah.
You talked at the beginning about the horn bases narrowing. What's causing that?
So the horn base on some of these is narrower because of that gland that's secreting oil, and it's just eating away. This is basically his hair. And
So is it the oil that's?
yeah, as the goat gets older, that gland gets, you know, more massive and juicy, and has more time to just erode away at that.
Okay, so it's the oil deteriorating the horn.
Yep, it's kind of just corroding it, and that's down to the core. So. Anybody else? Yeah.
When you set the goat quotas, do you just look at the total number of goats that you see, or do you factor in kids to adults or nannies and family ratios and things like that?
So when I calculate the actual percentage, I'm just looking at total animals seen. But then when I'm deciding if I go the 3% or the 5%, and how, if I do I round up, do I round down, when there's some rounding to do, that's when the number of kids I've seen comes into play, the amount of nanny take in that area comes into play, whether or not we've gone over quota and I have a hard time keeping that hunt in control comes into play. So really it's just the straight count leads to the number, and then I decide, well, it leads to a range of numbers, and then I decide what side of that range is appropriate. And then also the federal quota comes into that too. If there is, I mean, I have to consider that there is federal hunt opportunity. If I think it might be used, I need to factor that in to whether, which way we go, whether or not I gamble that it won't be taken.
Has the nanny rules, been in effect long enough to see a difference?
So it went into effect in 2015, and I think it depends on who you ask if you see a difference. I think the intent of the people in Cordova that put that proposal in was to curb habitual nanny take, and the people that have habitually taken nannies have only done it once.
Who would shoot a nanny?
Since 2015. So, they're waiting. Yeah. But whether or not, I mean, we mimicked that proposal, Cordovans mimicked that proposal off of a nanny provision that already existed on the Kenai. And on the Kenai, they felt like it hadn't made that much of an impact because most of their hunters were one and done. They were guys that just wanted to go and check that off their list. They didn't really care what they shot. Ours was different because there were people who were concerned that every year the same people were going into areas and taking out an animal two at a time, and that was preventing hunt opportunity for others. So the reasons for the proposals were slightly different, and so whether or not we gauge success or not is different. Yeah.
Have you ever done any GPS coloring, tracking things to find out the range of the animal?
So a lot of that work is happening in Southeast, and a lot of that research updates are on our website if you're interested. We haven't done any goat work with radio collars in any recent time. I saw some references to previous work with radio collars, but they would have been with straight GPS and probably in the 80s. So I don't think we'd have really great information, and I can't find it anyways, about goats around here. Right now, it's just not identified as a research priority. Down in Southeast, they're really looking at these cumulative effects and looking at mining areas and the heli skiing and a whole bunch of things that are coming together and a lot of activity down there. And then that's where our primo goat researcher lives. There's a little bit of radio collar goat research going on in Kodiak, but that's looking at a different research question. They're trying to understand how those goats are using habitat and how that could be potentially impacting other species. So for us, we haven't emerged as a research priority hotspot for doing that yet. Yeah?
How common are unicorns?
I wish I was clever.
I saw a couple
depends on if you ask my
villages this
daughter.
year, yeah, and I've heard reports of others that are completely broomed off and
Yeah.
have really no horns at all. Is that caused by disease, or does that just happen to be trauma in a couple individuals?
I mean,
or
I think these horns are just not durable against impact or falls. I mean, lots of people shoot a billy and it tumbles and it just
cracks
loses
off.
those horns. And so I think they're capable of falls when that happens. I have no idea of knowing how prevalent it is, except I've never had one brought into me that was broken before it was shot.
Mostly because people are selecting for goats
Yeah,
that have
although
both.
I think there are people that would be interested in, I mean, isn't that kind of like an abnormal? I mean, if you already had
Certainly.
some normal goat
Yep.
heads and you saw one that looked interesting, I don't know that someone would select against it necessarily. I don't know. If the more I try to think about the psychology of hunters, the more I
Sure.
realize that's like a rabbit hole I should not go down. Yeah. Jake.
Is there any possibility of repopulating the Haney Ridge?
Oh man, I pushed that idea with MBE, Jimmy. Can you look me up? MBE's been interested in moose projects and deer projects, and so every time they talk to me about moose projects and deer projects, I tell them, what about goats? I mean, this is a native species with a traditional use. We've got areas where they used to be and they're not anymore.
And they were taken out by humans.
And they were removed by humans. So, to me, it's kind of a no-brainer. I'd love to see it happen, and I think we could make a good argument because 232 is the nearest area to seed from, this one right here. And we know that if big old fat Cordova wasn't here, they would do it on their own. There's no concern of like disease transmission or introducing something somewhere, because it would be coming from something there's just an unnatural barrier keeping it from happening. So the problem is just budget priorities, especially now we have a new administration and we're trying to figure out how to pay the bills. But yeah, I fantasize about that.
It's so close.
If anybody's got a whole bunch of money to burn a hole in their fire, let me know.
Any idea how many goats could be supported on the Handy Ridge area?
Well, and I was trying to dig up today a real refined timeline, because 1976 is when the observation area was established, and then 1988 I found a report that said there were 105 goats there, but when I drilled down into it, that was for all of 232, and around 1988 is when we actually started like a really rigorous survey and inventory program. So I got to try to dig back and then figure out where the heck they were looking, with totally different names for survey areas and how, but because it said 105 goats and that's not what was there. So I don't know what it would take to do it, but.
I remember when Julius Reynolds put up that sign, and nobody had seen a goat on the Guinea Range forever. And I don't know if anybody's seeing a goat on the Guinea Range since. So I'm kind of thinking there's something wrong there. Because Julius put that up hoping that goats might come back at that point in time, but nobody's seen any goats on the Guinea Range since at least the 60s.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, I'm trying to drill back, and I put that on my long-term to-do list today. Figure out the timeline for the Handy Range. Julius was here from 64 to 84. So I'm guessing Julius had some knowledge of those goats being there and about the ballpark number he thought should be there. And that's why when 76 came around, he pushed for that goat observation area. I would guess they weren't gone, because it would be silly to make an observation area when there's like absolutely nothing to observe.
Well, it
But-
used to have a sign that said no goat hunting on that, and I remember talking with them about, Julius, why have a no goat hunting sign when there's no goats? And he said, we're hoping that there will be goats, but he hadn't seen goats.
It's like the Field of Dreams model of
Yeah.
wildlife.
There've been goats there since I've been here, and I'm sure you have the records, Charlotte.
A goat in 2006, Steve Monk took a
Yeah,
picture
I know
of.
it was two for a while? Anyway, I've seen them or that same animal, but,
Yeah, I found that sighting in the records today, and it was only one sighting, but I'm piecing together, picking up this
Yeah.
big breadcrumb from a couple sloppy wildlife biologists before me.
We're
I
so
don't-
close and there's a bridge, I mean, too, in the wintertime, I mean,
Yeah, I mean, highways are not barriers to goats necessarily. Jack Stevenson has talked about seeing goats walking across the delta. I don't think they're deterred by that necessarily, but I think when we get like a wall of cars and people taking pictures and dogs, and then it has to be more than one animal coming over. I mean, it's tougher than, it's not just gonna probably just happen. It might. Can dream. Girl can dream. Well, how about we turn on the lights and